Mae Gentry had buried her father on a Tuesday, her pride on a Wednesday, and by Thursday morning she was standing on the frost-hardened porch of the Gentry homestead in the Colorado Territory, pointing a Winchester rifle at a stranger on horseback, and telling him he had 3 seconds to explain himself before she made his hat considerably airier. The year was 1878, and the land around Hatchfield Crossing was the kind of beautiful that killed people who forgot to respect it. The peaks of the San Juan Mountains rose behind the valley like cathedral walls, and the sky between October and April turned a shade of gray that pressed down on a person's chest until breathing felt like labor. Mae knew that sky. She had grown up under it, watched it swallow her mother in the winter of 1869, and she had no particular fondness for strangers who arrived beneath it on horses that cost more than most men earned in 6 months of honest work. The man on the horse did not flinch at the rifle. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting loose on the pommel and the other held out and open where she could see it, and he looked at her with dark brown eyes that were neither afraid nor insulting. He was broad-shouldered and lean at the same time, the way working men got, and he had a jaw that needed a shave and a hat that had been rained on more times than it had ever been brushed. "Name's Lionel McCrae," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than addressing a woman who had a rifle aimed at the center of his chest. "I heard in town that your ranch needed a hired hand for the season. I'm offering my services." Mae did not lower the rifle. "Who told you that in town?" "Barkeep at the Silver Spur, name of Hollies." "Hollies talks too much," Mae said, "and I didn't say I was looking for a hired hand." "He said you were." "Hollies is not the foreman of this operation. I am." Lionel McCrae tilted his head slightly, and she thought she saw something move at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the memory of one. "Understood," he said. "Then I'll ask the foreman directly. You need help getting this ranch through winter. I can see it from here." That made her grip tight because it was the truth, and she despised the truth when it arrived on the lips of a stranger. She had 43 head of cattle, 12 horses, 2 farmhands who had already told her they were leaving before the first hard snow because her father's death had voided whatever loyalty they'd felt to the Gentry name, and a fence line on the north pasture that needed serious repair before November buried it under 3 feet of ice. She was 24 years old, she had calluses on her hands and fire in her eyes, and she had told herself every morning for the past 3 weeks that she did not need anyone. She lowered the rifle to her hip but did not lower her chin. "I'll give you 2 weeks of work," she said. $1 a day and supper. You sleep in the bunkhouse. I find you anywhere near this porch after dark. I'll shoot first and ask about it later." "Fair enough," said Lionel McCrae, and he swung down from his horse with the easy grace of a man who had been climbing on and off horses since before he could read. He was 27, she would later learn. Born in Texas, raised on cattle drives and bunkhouse floors, and he had spent the last 4 years drifting through Wyoming, Montana, and now Colorado, working one ranch until the season ended and moving on to the next. He had no particular attachment to any piece of ground. That was the thing she told herself she understood about him right from the start, which is why she assumed he would leave. She assumed it so completely that she never quite prepared herself for the possibility that he wouldn't. The first week, they barely spoke beyond necessity. Mae showed him the fence line, explained the feed rotation, pointed out which horses had difficult temperaments, and which cattle had a habit of pushing through weak sections of wire. Lionel listened without comment and worked without complaint. He was faster at fence repair than anyone she had ever seen, moving along the north pasture with a methodical precision that covered ground she had estimated would take 3 men 2 weeks to complete. He did it in 6 days. She told herself that was just efficiency. The second week, the first snow came. It wasn't the killing kind, just a dusting that turned the valley silver overnight and reminded everything living that the easy days were done. Me was in the barn at 4 in the morning because she always was in the barn at 4 in the morning during the first snows, checking on the pregnant mares and making sure the heat from the animals was sufficient and the door seals held against the wind. She had a lantern and a worn wool blanket over her shoulders, and she was crouched beside a gray mare named Clover when she heard the barn door open. She was on her feet with her hand on her belt knife before she saw it was Lionel, and he had the grace to stop and raise his hands immediately. "It's me," he said. "I know who it is," Me said, but she released the knife. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, I expect." He moved past her toward the far stall where the other pregnant mare, a chestnut called Blossom, was shifting restlessly. He crouched and looked and then rose. "She's going to foal soon. Maybe tonight." Me pressed her lips together. She had been thinking the same thing. "I know, you planning on staying up through it. I've stayed up through worse." "I'm sure you have," he said, and there was no condescension in it. He said it like a man who believed it completely and saw nothing unusual in the fact. That was the second thing she noticed about him. He never spoke to her the way most men in Hatchfield Crossing spoke to her, which was with that faint undertow of surprise, as if her competence were a magic trick they hadn't quite figured out the mechanism of. Lionel McCrae simply accepted that she knew what she was doing, and it disarmed her more thoroughly than any flattery could have. She didn't tell him he could stay, but she didn't tell him to leave either. She went back to her spot beside Clover, and Lionel settled against the wall on a bale of hay near Blossom, and they waited in the warm, animal-scented dark while the snow came down outside and the wind leaned against the old barn walls. Blossom foaled just before dawn. It was a colt, healthy and furious at the cold world he had arrived in, and Me talked him through his first uncertain legs while Lionel made sure the mother was comfortable and the stall was clean. When it was done and the colt was nursing and the gray pre-dawn light was beginning to seep through the gaps in the barn boards, Me sat back on her heels and felt the particular exhaustion and satisfaction that only that kind of work could produce. She looked across at Lionel, who was watching the colt with an expression she recognized without being able to name it. It was the look of a person who loved something they hadn't planned to love. "You've done this before," she said. "Many times," he said. "Never gets less remarkable." She decided that same morning to extend his employment through the end of the month. She told herself it was practical. The fence on the south pasture also needed work, and the barn roof had a soft spot above the middle stall that would not survive a heavy snowfall. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way he had crouched beside that chestnut mare in the dark, and known without being told that she needed watching. By the end of October, Mae Gentry's 2 original farmhands had left exactly as promised, loading their belongings onto a wagon and heading into Hatchfield Crossing without looking back, and Lionel McCrae was still there. He had fixed the barn roof, reinforced the south pasture fence, helped her drive the main herd down from the higher grazing ground before the trails became impassable, and he had done all of it without once suggesting that she didn't know what she was doing or that she needed someone to make her decisions. He also had a habit that she found quietly maddening, which was that he made coffee before dawn and left a cup on the kitchen step without knocking. She would open the door and it would be there, steam rising in the cold air, and she could never decide whether to thank him or tell him to stop. She did neither. She drank the coffee. On the last day of October, Me came out to find him replacing a section of the porch railing that had been loose since spring. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and watched him work for a moment. "Your 2 weeks are long done," she said. "They are," he agreed, without looking up from the railing. "I haven't offered you a new arrangement." "No, you haven't, and you're still here." He looked up then. The morning light was flat and gray, but his eyes were warm in it, and there was that almost smile again. "It's a good ranch," he said simply. Me was quiet for a long moment. She was 24 years old and she had learned, mostly through loss, to be careful with things she couldn't afford to break. Her father had been the last of her people, and his absence had left a silence in the house that she filled with work because work was the only language she had ever trusted completely. She did not, as a rule, trust men. She had watched men leave, watched them make promises and then weigh those promises against their own convenience and find the promises wanting. She had not had a single conversation in the 3 weeks since her father died in which someone didn't suggest that she should sell the ranch, take the money, and go somewhere easier. Lionel McCrae had never once suggested that. "I'll pay you through November," she said at last. "After that, we renegotiate." "That's fine," he said, and went back to the railing. November in the Colorado Territory was not a gentle month. The snows that had been a suggestion in October became a declaration in November, and the wind off the mountains carried a cold that found every gap in every seam. Me and Lionel fell into a rhythm that she could not have predicted and would not have asked for. He was up before her and had the horses fed before she reached the barn, and she had supper on the table before he washed up at the pump. And somewhere between those two fixed points, the work of the day happened in a way that felt, increasingly and terrifyingly, like partnership. They talked during supper. That had started almost by accident, with practical conversation about the next day's work. And then one evening she had asked where he learned to work cattle, and he had talked for an hour about growing up in the Texas Panhandle, about his father who had been a drover and his mother who had died when he was 9, about the first trail drive he had ridden at 14, and the way the land changed color as you moved north, and the particular silence of the high plains at night. He talked without self-pity and without exaggeration, the way people talked who had made their peace with their own histories, and me listened with a stillness she recognized as attention. She told him about her father in return, because it seemed fair, about how John Gentry had homesteaded this valley in 1861, when it was nothing but grass and hope, and how he had built this house with his own hands and her mother's beside him, and how the winter of 1869 had taken her mother to a fever that no amount of work or love could slow, and how her father had kept going with a quiet stubbornness that she had inherited along with the ranch and the Winchester. She told him about learning to ride before she could read and learning to shoot before she could do either properly, and how the valley looked in April when the snow retreated and the first green came up through the mud, and it was so beautiful it almost hurt. Lionel listened with the same quality of attention she had given him, and when she was done he said, "No wonder you won't leave it." "Has anyone suggested I should?" she said, and the sharpness in her voice was a reflex she couldn't help. "No," he said. "I'm saying it makes sense, that you'd fight for it." She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them and the wind pressing at the windows, and she thought that this was a dangerous kind of comfortable. The comfortable that came before the leaving always felt this way, she suspected, warm and certain and completely unearned. "Lionel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. She had been saying McCrae, which kept a useful distance. He looked up. "Winter here is not a minor inconvenience," she said. "It's something that has to be survived. Men who came through here thinking they understood it have left with frostbitten hands and broken pride. I need you to understand that before December, because if you leave in January I'll be short-handed at the worst possible time, and I can't afford that." He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he didn't answer immediately, because immediate answers to serious questions were usually lies. "I'm not planning on leaving," he said finally. "Men who plan on leaving rarely announce it ahead of time," she said. "And men who plan on staying often don't either. I'm not asking about your plans. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself about what this winter is going to cost, and then decide." He looked at her steadily. "And if I tell you I've already decided, then I'll believe it when February comes and you're still standing in this kitchen." He nodded once, a slow, deliberate nod, as if he were making a record of something. "February," he said. "All right." That night, lying in her bed listening to the wind work itself into a fury outside, Mae Gentry told herself she had been clear and practical, and that she had given him a reasonable way to understand the situation. She told herself she had been sensible. She did not tell herself the way her heart had moved when he said he wasn't planning on leaving, because that was the kind of information she couldn't afford to carry. December arrived in the Colorado Territory like a man who had been traveling a long time and was done being patient. The temperature dropped through the floor, the snow came in waves, and 3 of Me's cattle broke through a weak section of fence near the creek and had to be found in a blizzard that turned the world white and featureless and mean. Lionel rode out with her without being asked, both of them wrapped in every layer they owned, working by feel and instinct because vision was essentially useless. They found 2 of the cattle in less than an hour, but the third was a stubborn old roan that had wandered half a mile downstream and gotten itself wedged in a snowdrift near a stand of cottonwoods. Me saw the problem first and spurred her horse toward it, but the drift was deeper than it looked and her mare sank to the knee and stumbled. She didn't fall, but she came close, and she heard Lionel shout something behind her that the wind took apart before she could make out the words. He was beside her in a moment, his horse more sure-footed in the deeper snow, and together they got ropes on the roan and hauled it out of the drift with a great deal of effort and language that Me would not have used in church. On the way back, with the cattle ahead of them and the blizzard still screaming, their horses came close enough that their legs touched in the swirling snow, and Lionel reached out without thinking and grabbed her arm, not pulling, just holding, the way you held onto something you didn't want the wind to take. She let him. She didn't pull away, and when they reached the barn and got the cattle secured and the horses rubbed down and blanketed, and they stood in the relative shelter of the barn doorway with ice in their eyelashes and their breath coming in white clouds, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something shifted between them that neither of them named. He went to the bunkhouse. She went to the house. The coffee was on the kitchen step the next morning as usual. Christmas of 1878 was a quiet thing. There was no family to gather, no church close enough to reach in the snow. Me made a simple meal from what the pantry held, and Lionel appeared at the door of the house at noon with his hat in his hand and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "You don't have to knock," she said, because she had told him weeks ago that the porch rule only applied at night, and she felt the formality of him standing there hat in hand was unnecessary and somewhat unnerving. "It's Christmas," he said. Felt right. She stepped back and let him in. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the venison stew she'd had simmering since morning, and he stood just inside the door looking around the way he always did in the house, as if he were memorizing it. He handed her the package. She took it with more dignity than she felt, turned it in her hands, and opened it carefully. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, finely made, lined with rabbit fur, the kind of gloves that cost real money and the kind that were practical in exactly the way Mae Gentry's life required. She looked up at him. "These are good gloves. Your others are worn through at the fingertips," he said. "I noticed." She put them on. They fit perfectly. She looked at her hands in the rabbit fur-lined leather and thought that he had noticed the state of her gloves and gone to town and spent his own wages on replacing them, and that was more intimate than most things she had allowed herself in a very long time. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with more weight than the words usually carried. She gave him the pocket watch she had bought in town the previous week, using money she had intended for other things. It had a plain case and a reliable mechanism, and she had spent 10 minutes at the counter in Holly's store debating whether giving a hired hand a Christmas gift was appropriate or presumptuous, before deciding that Lionel McCrae was rapidly becoming something more complicated than a hired hand, and that the watch was a good watch, and he needed one, and that was reason enough. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment, and when he looked up his eyes had a quality she hadn't seen in them before, something that moved and unguarded, and he said, "Me," and then stopped, as if the word were the beginning of something longer that he hadn't yet figured out how to say. "Sit down," she said. "Dinner's ready." They ate Christmas dinner in the warm kitchen while the snow came down outside, and the conversation moved easily from practical matters to memories and back again. And at one point Me said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, low and warm and surprised, and she thought she could get used to that sound, which was exactly the kind of thought she had been trying to avoid. January came, and it was exactly as brutal as she had promised. There were 3 days in the middle of the month where the cold was so severe that they could not move the cattle at all, and simply had to keep them as warm as possible and pray. 2 of the horses developed a respiratory sickness, and me and Lionel took turns sitting up with them through the night, and on the 3rd night Lionel found her asleep against the barn wall at 2 in the morning, having been awake for 30 hours, and he woke her with a hand on her shoulder and told her to go to the house and sleep, that he would watch. She was too exhausted to argue, which was the only circumstance under which she would not have. She fell asleep in her bed thinking that he was still out there in the barn, and the thought was not alarming. That was the alarming part. The thought of him there felt like what something feels like when it belongs in its place. Both horses recovered. On the morning of the 4th day, when they were clearly improving and the worst of the cold had broken by a few degrees, me came into the barn to find Lionel asleep in the hay with his coat over him and the horses eating calmly. She stood in the barn doorway for a long moment looking at him. He looked younger asleep, the habitual watchfulness of his face gone slack, and she could see the exhaustion in the lines of him, the cost of 3 nights of watching, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she had been keeping shut for a very long time. She went back to the house and made breakfast, the best she could manage from what they had, and when he came in, blinking and stiff-jointed and sheepish, she had eggs and cornbread and coffee on the table, and she said simply, "Sit down and eat. You earned it." He sat. He ate. He didn't say much because he was too tired, and she didn't push conversation because she knew what tired felt like. But at the end of it, he looked across the table at her and said, "The horses are going to be all right." "I know," she said, "because of you." The bluntness of that surprised him. She could see it. "It was the 2 of us," he said. "It was more you," she said, and she held his gaze while she said it because Mae Gentry had a lot of qualities and dishonesty was not one of them. He looked at her for a long moment in the January morning light. "Me," he said again, and again it was the beginning of something, but this time he pushed through it. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly." She set down her coffee cup. "Then say it." "I'm not here because of the wages," he said. "I've been places that pay better and ask less. I'm here because I don't want to be anywhere else, and I think you know that, and I think it scares you, and I understand why. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. But I wanted you to know it plainly because you're a person who deserves plain words." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. "It does scare me," she said, because she was also a person who dealt in plain words. "People I've needed have a history of leaving." "I know," he said, "and I know you gave me a deadline, February. I haven't forgotten it." "It's January," she said. "It is. Ask me again in February." He nodded once, that same deliberate nod she had come to recognize as his way of making a contract with himself. "In February," he said. February came in the Colorado Territory with a week of storms that tested every structure on the Gentry Ranch and the fortitude of every living creature on it. The roof of the smaller storage shed came down under the weight of accumulated snow, losing a winter's worth of stored hay in a single night. Me stood in the ruins of it the next morning in the gray pre-dawn, calculating what she had left and what she could do with it, and she felt for the first time the real fear that the ranch might not survive the winter. Not because of anything she hadn't done, but because some winters were simply larger than the preparations you could make for them. Lionel came and stood beside her in the ruins. He looked at it for a moment and then said, "Teller's Creek Ranch, about 4 miles northeast. They'd sell hay or at least lend some of it. The Beaumont family, good people." "I know the Beaumonts," me said. "You willing to ask?" She was quiet for a moment. Asking for help was not a skill she had developed. It sat against the grain of everything her father had taught her, which was mostly that you grew what you needed and made what you couldn't grow, and the only thing asking bought you was dependency. But she looked at the ruined shed and the numbers in her head, and she said, "Yes." They rode to Teller's Creek that same day, through snow that was knee-deep on the horses, and Calvin Beaumont, a red-faced man in his 50s who had known John Gentry for 20 years, sold them half his surplus hay at a price that was fair, and helped them load it without being asked. His wife came out with hot coffee and a look at Lionel that me caught out of the corner of her eye, a look that said she was sizing him up and finding him acceptable. Me thought that was probably none of anybody's business, but kept it to herself. On the ride back, loaded down with hay, the sky cleared unexpectedly, the way Colorado skies sometimes did, throwing off the cloud cover like a coat to reveal a blue so deep it looked like something from the beginning of the world. The mountains were white and enormous and impossibly clean-looking, and the valley below them was a long silver sweep, and me pulled up her horse for a moment to look at it because she never could pass a view like that without stopping. Lionel pulled up beside her. "There it is," she said. He looked at the valley, at the ranch buildings small in the distance, at the mountains rising behind everything. He was quiet for a long moment. "It's the finest place I've ever seen," he said. "February," she said. He turned to look at her. The cold had put color high on his cheeks and his dark eyes were steady and certain. "I'm still here," he said. "You are," she said. "So I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had ridden into her life on an expensive horse and stayed through the worst winter she could remember, who had fixed her fences and saved her horses and bought her gloves that fit and laughed when she said something funny and never once suggested she needed managing. She thought about the fear she had told him about, the history of people leaving, and she thought about the fact that in all her life she had never known a person who showed up in exactly the way they said they would, who did what they promised and a little more, without announcement and without waiting for applause. "I am not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about how work is done and I don't always express them with patience, and I hold grudges longer than is probably spiritually advisable, and I don't like to ask for help and I am working on that as you have observed." "I know all of that," he said, and I'm asking anyway." She looked at the valley one more time, her valley, her father's dream made into something real and surviving by the stubbornness of the Gentry family and the Colorado winter, and now, it appeared, by one drifting cowboy who had refused to drift. She looked back at Lionel McCrae. "You can court me," she said, "properly, and if you leave before spring I'll never forgive you." "I'm not leaving," he said. "Then we understand each other." She set her horse moving again, back toward the ranch, and he fell in beside her, and neither of them said anything more about it, because there was nothing more that needed saying. The horses moved through the snow at a steady walk, and the sky was that impossible blue above them, and Mae Gentry felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the careful, terrifying, extraordinary sensation of hope. Spring came to the Colorado territory like a debt being paid. The snow retreated up the mountains by inches and then by feet, and the creek running along the east border of the Gentry ranch rose with snowmelt and rushed along with a sound like celebration, and the first green showed itself in the south pasture in the middle of March, and when me saw it she was standing beside Lionel at the pasture fence, and she grabbed his arm without thinking, just grabbed it and pointed and said, "There, do you see it?" "I see it," he said, and he was smiling. They hired 2 new ranch hands in April, brothers named Deke and Amos Webb, who were hardworking and honest, and asked no uncomfortable questions about the arrangement at the Gentry ranch, which was increasingly an arrangement that required no questions to understand. Lionel worked alongside the brothers as their clear superior without having claimed the title, and me found that the ranch ran with an efficiency she had never quite managed alone, not because her own abilities were lacking, but because some things genuinely required more than one pair of hands. She found she trusted him. That was the thing that surprised her most. Not gradually and conditionally, the way she had expected to trust if she ever trusted again, but with a comprehensiveness that made her understand why people wrote songs about falling. It wasn't a decision you made. It was a discovery you woke up to. The way you woke up and realized spring had arrived without you having to push it. He courted her in the way of a man who understood what she actually was, not flowers and flattery, though he did occasionally bring her small things: a perfect piece of rose quartz he found by the creek, a book of poems from the bookshop in Hatchfield Crossing, the kind of book she would never have bought for herself but opened late at night by lamplight and found herself embarrassingly moved by. He courted her by being present, reliably and without performance. He courted her by taking her seriously. In May, he kissed her for the first time, and she had kissed him back, and they had stood in the south pasture in the late afternoon light with the mountains going golden and the new grass under their feet, and she had rested her forehead against his shoulder, and he had put his arms around her, and neither of them had spoken because the moment was fully occupied already. "I love you," he said, into her hair, as if he had been saying it for a while and was simply saying it aloud now. She pulled back far enough to look at him. His face was open in a way she had learned to read over the winter, the way it looked when he was not constructing anything, just existing in the unguarded way that was his best and truest self. "I love you," she said. "That is a fact I have been resisting for approximately 4 months." He laughed, that warm, surprised laugh. "Only 4. Don't push it," she said, and kissed him again. They were married in June of 1879, in the open air beside the ranch house, with the valley laid out before them and the mountains behind them, and a minister from Hatchfield Crossing who had ridden out for the occasion. Deacon Amos Webb stood witness, and Calvin Beaumont and his wife came from Teller's Creek, and Hollies from the Silver Spur Saloon arrived somewhat out of breath and very pleased with himself, since he had been the one to send Lionel out to the Gentry ranch in the first place, and considered the whole business largely his doing. Mae wore a dress that had been her mother's, let out and altered and pressed within an inch of its life, and she wore the leather gloves at her belt because they were hers, and she intended to work in them for another 20 years. Lionel wore his best shirt and a string tie and the pocket watch, which she could see the chain of at his vest, and when the minister said the words that needed saying and Lionel took her hands in both of his, she felt the weight of the occasion settle over her, not heavy but solid, real. She thought about her father, who had wanted this valley to be a home and had made it one through sheer refusal to quit. She thought about her mother, who had walked into this same valley as a bride and built a life in it until the winter took her. She thought about the long line of Gentrys who had put their hands into this particular piece of Colorado ground, and she thought that the line would not end here. "I do," she said, when the moment asked for it, and she meant it with every bone she had. The first year of marriage was not without its difficulties, because any year in the Colorado Territory was not without difficulties, and two strong-willed people building a life in a hard place did not always find their way to the same decision by the same route. There were arguments, real ones, conducted with the full, honest heat of two people who respected each other enough not to pretend. There was one sustained disagreement about whether to increase the herd size that lasted 3 weeks and was eventually resolved in Mae's favor, which Lionel accepted without resentment, and one shorter but more intense argument about a business decision Mae made without consulting him that she eventually admitted had been the wrong way to handle it, which she accepted without excessive self-flagellation. They learned the specific shape of each other's stubbornness and the specific location of each other's tenderness, and they used this knowledge mostly with care. In the autumn of 1880, Mae gave birth to their son. He arrived in the middle of September with a set of lungs that startled the horses, and Mae held him while Lionel stood beside the bed with a look on his face that she had never seen before, a helpless, wide-open, reverent look, as if the world had just rearranged itself into a configuration he hadn't anticipated and found too large to entirely comprehend. "Hello," Lionel said to the baby, a greeting simple and complete. They named him John Thomas McCrae, for Mae's father and Lionel's, and he was called Jack from the first week because John Thomas was a great deal of name for a very small person, and the ranch hands declared he looked like a Jack, and that was that. Jack McCrae grew up with the same sky over him that his mother had grown up under, the same mountains and the same creek, and the same hard, beautiful country that required love and labor in equal measure. He was a serious child, and then a serious boy, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's deliberate way of thinking before he spoke. And he could ride before he was 4, and was earnestly useful with fence work by the time he was 7. In 1883, Mae gave birth to their daughter, Clara, who was her mother's opposite in temperament. Where Jack was deliberate, Clara was impulsive. Where Jack worked in silence, Clara worked with running commentary about every aspect of what she was doing, and what everything around her was doing, and what she thought about all of it. She was a wonderful, exhausting, completely beloved child, and from the time she could walk, she followed Lionel around the ranch like a small devoted shadow, asking questions he answered with the same patience he gave to everything. The ranch grew in those years with the care and work that Lionel and me poured into it. They added acreage in 1881, purchasing the adjacent parcel from a homesteader who had decided the territory was not for him. And Lionel proved himself not only a skilled ranch hand, but a person with genuine instincts for land and livestock management. Mae had spent her childhood watching her father run the ranch and her adulthood learning to run it herself, and she trusted her own judgment. But she found that Lionel's judgment was worth consulting and occasionally worth deferring to, and the combination of their thinking produced decisions that were better than either of them would have made alone. The town of Hatchfield Crossing grew too in those years. A railway spur reached it in 1882, which changed the economics of cattle ranching in ways both useful and complicated. Markets that had been days away by trail became accessible in ways that altered how a ranch planned its year. Mae and Lionel were among the first ranchers in the valley to understand what the railroad meant and to adapt to it, and they did so in partnership with Calvin Beaumont and 1 or 2 others, negotiating freight rates with the railroad representatives in a meeting in Hollies' saloon that lasted most of an afternoon, and ended with a deal that served the valley ranchers better than the railroad company had intended to offer. Hollies, watching me lay out her argument to the railroad man with the quiet precision of a person who had been running numbers in her head since childhood, leaned over to Lionel and said in a low voice, "Remind me never to negotiate against your wife." "Smart man," Lionel said. In 1885, there was a dry summer that put genuine pressure on the grass and water, and the Gentry McCrae ranch survived it better than most because Lionel had insisted 2 years earlier on deepening the well and improving the creek-fed irrigation channel on the south pasture, a project Mae had agreed with in principle but had delayed on practical grounds, and she was honest enough to tell him that his forethought had made the difference. "You would have gotten there," he said. "Probably a year too late," she said. "I have my moments," he said. "You have quite a few of them," she said. "Don't let it go to your head." Jack was in school by this point, riding the 4 miles to Hatchfield Crossing 3 days a week, and Clara was not yet school age but had already taught herself to read using her brother's primers with a self-directed intensity that amused and slightly alarmed her parents. Lionel found her one evening in the lamplight reading at a speed that seemed implausible for a 4-year-old and said, "Clara, what are you reading?" "A history of the Roman Empire," Clara said, without looking up. "I found it on the shelf. The Romans were very interesting people, though they had some significant faults." Lionel looked at me, who was sitting across the room with her face absolutely composed. "She found it on the shelf," he said. "She finds everything on the shelf," Mae said. "I've stopped being surprised." Those years moved with the quality of good years, rich and full and layered with enough difficulty to keep them honest. There was the winter of 1886, which was known as the hard winter across the whole of the territory, the kind of cold that killed cattle across the open range and broke ranchers who had been building for decades. The Gentry McCrae ranch lost 17 head that winter, and it was a real blow, but the herd they had built was large enough to absorb it, and the decisions they had made about shelter and feed stores proved their value. They went into 1887 diminished but not broken, and that itself was something to stand on. There was the spring of 1887, when a man named Garrett Holloway arrived in Hatchfield Crossing, with papers claiming an old right-of-way across the east corner of the Gentry McCrae property. Papers that turned out to be fraudulent upon legal examination, but required 3 months of correspondence with a lawyer in Denver, and one trip by Lionel and me to Denver itself to establish the fact. The train ride was the first time either of them had been to Denver in years, and they spent 2 nights in a hotel, which was a complete luxury, and walked the city streets in the evenings feeling pleasantly out of place, and had dinner in a restaurant with tablecloths where me wore the blue dress she almost never had occasion to wear, and Lionel looked at her across the table with an expression that had not diminished in 8 years of marriage by 1 degree of warmth. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." "You're staring," she said. "It's a free country," he said. "Largely, we've discussed this." She laughed, and he thought again that he could live his entire life for that laugh and consider it well spent. The Holloway matter was resolved in their favor. The papers were fraud, the land was theirs, and Garrett Holloway relocated to somewhere that was not Hatchfield Crossing with some haste, which was generally considered the appropriate outcome. Jack grew into adolescence with the quiet steadiness his parents had hoped for, and at 15 he was doing the work of a man on the ranch and doing it well, though he had also developed a secondary passion for mathematics that Lionel encouraged quietly by ordering a mathematics textbook from the catalog and leaving it on Jack's bed without comment. Jack found it, worked through it in 3 months, and then asked for another, and Lionel ordered it. And this happened several times until it became clear that Jack McCrae had a mind that was going to require more than ranch work to satisfy it, which was a conversation that me and Lionel had one night after the children were in bed with the careful honesty of 2 parents who both loved their son and had slightly different instincts about what his future should look like. Me, who had been born into a life where ranching was the only vocabulary, surprised Lionel by saying that she thought Jack should be allowed to go further in his schooling, if that was what he wanted. "This ranch is here," she said. "It will be here, but his mind is something that deserves to be developed, and I don't want to be the thing that limited it." Lionel looked at her across the table with an expression that she knew very well by now, the warm, steady, grateful look of a man who knew exactly how much he loved the person he was looking at. "He has your determination," Lionel said. "He has yours," she said. "He thinks before he acts, that's you." "We made a good one," Lionel said. "We made 2 good ones," me said, "though Clara is a separate and ongoing challenge." Clara was 12 in 1895, and she was exactly as her earliest indicators had suggested she would be. Brilliant, stubborn, inexhaustibly curious, with a passion for argument that was either going to take her somewhere remarkable or make her very unpopular in all the places she went, and possibly both simultaneously. She was also deeply kind, in the way that people were kind when they had been raised in a home where kindness was practiced rather than preached, and she had a relationship with the land around her that mirrored her mother's, a love of it that was physical and specific and non-negotiable. In the later years of the century, there were changes in the territory that the ranch had to navigate. The cattle market shifted. The open range, which had defined how ranching worked for 2 decades, was giving way to fenced land and new pressures, and ranchers who did not adapt found themselves squeezed by the changes. Me and Lionel had always run a fenced operation, which put them ahead of some of the shifts, and they diversified the ranch in the late 1890s in ways that kept them viable while others struggled. They brought in sheep, which was a decision that raised eyebrows in some quarters of Hatchfield Crossing, where the old tensions between cattle and sheep ranchers still echoed, but me made her decision with the numbers in front of her and declined to apologize for it. There were also the broader changes in the territory itself, the growing population, the changing relationship between the established ranching families and the new settlers who came with each decade, and the ongoing injustices in how the land had been taken and from whom. Mae had grown up knowing that the Colorado Territory had been Apache and Ute land before it was homesteaded, and her father had spoken of this with a straightforwardness that was unusual for the time. Not guilt that changed anything, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement that the land had a history that preceded his arrival. Mae carried that awareness, and she passed it to her children in the same unvarnished way, telling them that the valley they loved had belonged to others before them, and that this was a fact they should hold with humility even as they worked the land with love. It was a conversation she had with Clara when the girl was 16 that she remembered most clearly. They were riding the ridge above the south pasture, and Clara had been asking about the territory's history with the directness she brought to all things, and Mae had answered with the same directness. And at the end of it, Clara had said, "That means what we have was not simply built, it was also taken." And Mae had said, "Yes." And the right response to that is to be honest about it, and to treat the land and the people around us with respect, and to use what we have to build something worth building. You can't undo the past, but you can decide what kind of person you are in the present. Clara had been quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a complicated answer." And Mae had said, "It's a complicated truth." Lionel, when Mae told him about this conversation later, said, "She's going to write a book someday. She's going to do approximately 40 things," Mae said. "The book might be among them." Jack did go to further schooling. In 1897, at 17, he went to Denver to attend a school that would prepare him for the kind of mathematical study he had developed a passion for, and Lionel rode with him to the station in Hatchfield Crossing and stood on the platform while the train pulled in with all its noise and smoke and consequence, and Jack shook his father's hand, which Lionel answered by pulling him into a brief, solid embrace that surprised them both. "Come home when you can," Lionel said. "I will," Jack said. He picked up his bag and then turned back. "Dad, take care of the south pasture fence near the creek. Third post from the cottonwood is going soft." Lionel laughed. "I'll get to it." "This week," Jack said. "Before the rain." "You are your mother's son," Lionel said. Jack grinned, and the train took him, and Lionel stood on the platform watching it go until it was only a sound in the distance, and then he turned and walked back to the wagon. And on the drive home through the valley that was golden in the September light, he allowed himself to feel both the pride and the sadness that were apparently the two currencies of loving a child well enough to let them go. Mae was on the porch when he got back. She saw his face and she came down the steps and put her arms around him and held him without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the holding. "He'll be all right," she said after a while. "I know," Lionel said, his chin on the top of her head. "He's a capable man. I'm just not used to him being a man." "I know," she said. "When did that happen?" "Too fast," he said. Clara stayed on the ranch through her own adolescence, with the focused energy of someone who was storing up strength for something. She helped run the ranch with an authority that was different from her mother's but equally effective, and she read everything she could find, ordering books from Denver and sometimes from publishers in New York and Chicago, and she had correspondence with people that her parents knew only vaguely as names in letters that arrived regularly. At 19, in the spring of 1902, Clara announced that she intended to go to a teacher's college in Colorado Springs. She announced it at dinner with the calm certainty of someone who had already made the decision and was informing rather than consulting, which Mae recognized as a family trait and tried not to be amused by too visibly. Lionel put down his fork and said, "Tell me about the school." Clara did in considerable detail and answered his questions with the same detail, and at the end of the conversation Lionel said, "All right, we'll talk about how to pay for it." "I have some ideas about that," Clara said. "Of course you do," Mae said. "The 20th century arrived in the Colorado Territory without the cattle realizing it, which Mae thought was appropriate. The land was still the land. The mountains were still the mountains. The creek still ran along the east border of the Gentry McCrae ranch with the sound of years in it. All the years Mae could remember, and the years before her that she could only imagine. She was 48 in 1902. Lionel was 51. They had been married 23 years, which was a number that seemed implausible in some lights and entirely inevitable in others. The ranch was the best it had ever been, larger and more productive than even Mae Gentry's most optimistic vision for it, with land that had been worked and rested and worked again by two people who understood that the relationship between a farmer and their land was a long conversation that required patience and respect from both parties. Lionel's hair had gone gray at the temples in his mid-40s and then throughout, and it suited him in a way that Mae mentioned only once, saying that it made him look distinguished, which caused him to look at her with genuine suspicion and say, "What do you want?" She had laughed and said she didn't want anything. She was simply making an accurate observation, and he had said that in his experience accurate observations delivered without context were frequently a preliminary to something, and she had conceded that she did want him to look at the generator that had arrived for the well system because she suspected it needed adjustment, and he had said, "There it is," and she had laughed again, and they had been married 23 years. Jack came home for Christmas in 1902. He had completed his schooling and had taken a position with a surveying company in Denver, doing the kind of precise mathematical work that had always been his particular pleasure. He arrived on the train looking like a city man around the edges and a ranch boy at the center, and he spent the first morning home in the barn with his father looking at the horses and not saying much, which was its own kind of conversation. He had brought someone with him. Her name was Helen, a quiet woman his own age with steady eyes and a dry sense of humor, and Mae liked her immediately with a certainty that she trusted, because her instincts about people had been reliable for a long time. Helen was a schoolteacher in Denver, and she watched the ranch operation with the careful attention of a person who was learning something she hadn't known before, and she helped with the cooking without being asked and was honest about what she did and didn't know how to do. And by the end of the Christmas visit, Mae had told Lionel that she thought Helen was exactly the right person for their son. "What makes you say so?" Lionel asked. She told him he was wrong about the irrigation schedule, Mae said. "In front of us, and he listened to her. Good basis for a marriage," Lionel said. "It's worked for us," Mae said. Jack and Helen married in the spring of 1903, in Denver, with a ceremony that was more elaborate than what Mae and Lionel had managed in 1879, but no more meaningful. Mae wore a different blue dress, a newer one that Clara had helped her select in Hatchfield Crossing with the focused determination of a person who had opinions about fabric and intended to use them, and Lionel wore a proper suit that he was visibly uncomfortable in for approximately the first hour, and then forgot about. Clara attended the wedding between terms at the teachers' college, arriving and departing with the efficiency of someone whose time was carefully managed. She was growing into herself in those years, becoming the full version of the person she had always been indicating she would be, and watching her was a particular pleasure for both Mae and Lionel, who found in their daughter a reminder of every quality they most valued in each other. In 1905, Jack and Helen's first child was born, a son. They named him William, and Mae, who received the telegram at the ranch and read it standing in the kitchen in the April morning light, sat down quite suddenly in a kitchen chair and pressed the telegram against her chest and felt the world turn over in a slow, enormous way. Lionel found her there when he came in from the barn. He read the telegram over her shoulder and then pulled up a chair beside her and sat in it and said nothing for a long moment. "William," Mae said. "William," Lionel agreed. "Jack is a father," she said. "He is," Lionel said. His voice was quiet and full of something that needed no name. Mae turned to look at him. 26 years she had been looking at this face, and it still had the capacity to move her, perhaps more than ever, because by now she could read every quality of every expression, the map of a face she knew as well as the valley below the ranch house and loved considerably more. "We're grandparents," she said. "We are," he said. She put her hand over his and his turned to hold it, the way it had been turning to hold it for 26 years, as if it knew the gesture before she made it. I dared you to stay through one winter, she said. Do you remember? He looked at her with that warm, steady, unguarded look. I remember. You were still there in February, she said. I was, he said. And in spring, she said. And summer, and every winter after. And every winter after, he agreed. She shook her head slowly, not in disbelief but in a kind of gratitude that was too large for words and so expressed itself as motion. Lionel McCrae, she said. Me McCrae, he said. He had been saying it that way for 26 years, her name in his mouth with a weight that never diminished. She laughed, a little at the occasion of it. At the strangeness and completeness of sitting in this kitchen, in this house that her father had built and she had kept, and they had built further together, holding a telegram that said they were grandparents now, which meant that the thing she had started was continuing. The line of people who would know this valley and love it and put their hands into it had extended forward into a generation she hadn't met yet. And it was continuing because a drifting cowboy on an expensive horse had appeared at her gate in October of 1878, and she had pointed a rifle at him and he had not flinched. Thank you, she said. He looked at her carefully. For what? For staying, she said. For being a person who stays. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice had the gravity and the warmth of a man who had thought about this, who had known for 26 years exactly where his life was and what it was worth. Me, he said. Staying was the easiest thing I ever did. She looked at him steadily. Liar, she said with love. The second easiest, he amended. The easiest was falling in love with you. She laughed again, and he squeezed her hand. And the April light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table. And outside the valley was green and new the way it was every spring, unfailingly, as if the world considered it a matter of basic duty. They went to Denver to meet William and Mae, taking the train that now ran directly from Hatchfield, crossing to the city without stops. The train itself still gave me a feeling of incongruity, the speed and noise of it against the slow, patient rhythms of ranch life. But she had made her peace with it years ago. She pressed her nose against the window as they passed through the mountains, watching the peaks go by in a way they never went by on horseback, too fast and too high, but spectacular in a different register. Helen met them at the station with the baby in a carrying cloth against her chest, and Jack stood beside her looking simultaneously terrified and incandescent with pride, and me walked directly to Helen and looked at the baby and said, "Hello, William," in the voice she had used with the newborn foal in the barn in 1878, the voice that was calm and certain, and said everything was going to be fine. William looked at her with the unfocused attention of a 2-month-old, and then closed his eyes, which she took as acceptance. Lionel stood behind her, looking over her shoulder at the baby, and me felt his hand settle at the small of her back, the familiar weight of it as automatic and certain as breathing. He has the McCrae jaw, Lionel said. He does not, me said. He has no jaw yet, he's a baby. He has the foundation of the McCrae jaw, Lionel said. You are impossible, me said. You've known that for 27 years, Lionel said. They stayed in Denver for 2 weeks. Long enough for me to learn the baby's schedule and Helen's systems, and to offer help without imposing, and to tell Jack 3 separate times that he was doing well, which was the kind of reassurance that she had needed as a young person, and had never quite received and had always remembered. He was doing well. He was a thoughtful father and a loving husband, and a man she was proud of. And she told him so plainly because Mae Gentry had never learned to leave important things unsaid. On the train home, passing back through the mountains in the direction of the valley, Lionel had his arm around her and she leaned against him in the way she had been leaning against him for years, adjusted to the particular geometry of his shoulder and chest in the way of 2 people who have found their fit. You were right, he said. About what specifically, she said. The list is long and I'll need to know which item we're discussing. He smiled. About the ranch, he said. About staying, about all of it. I'm usually right, she said. "You've known that for 27 years, he laughed. "I have." She was quiet for a while, watching the mountains pass. "We need to check the fence on the north pasture when we get back," she said. "Amos said there was a soft post near the upper gate." "Amos is right," Lionel said. "I've been meaning to get to it." "This week," she said. "Before the rain," he said. She turned to look at him. He was smiling with his eyes closed, his head back against the seat, and she thought that 27 years had changed the surface of him in the ways that time changed everything. The gray at his temples that went to his chest now, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he laughed, and she was glad for every one of them because it meant she had been making him laugh for a long time. The slight thickening at the jaw that softened a face that had once been almost severe. But the thing at the center of him was unchanged, the steadiness that had been there from the first morning, the quality of presence that was his most essential characteristic, the way he occupied a space not loudly but completely. She loved him in the way that she had come to understand was the most real kind of loving, not the dramatic and disorienting love of the beginning, but the deep, structural love that came from years of choosing each other again in the small daily decisions, of knowing someone's faults and choosing them anyway, of being known with all your own faults and being chosen back. She loved him the way you loved the valley, which was with knowledge and history, and a kind of permanence that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with bone-deep certainty. She closed her own eyes and let the train carry them home. Clara qualified as a schoolteacher in 1904 and came back to Hatchfield Crossing, which was the outcome Mae had hoped for and carefully refrained from hoping for out loud. She took a position at the school in town and rode in from the ranch 3 days a week, and from a room in town the other 2, and she was by all accounts a remarkable teacher, which surprised no one who had watched her explain the faults of the Roman Empire at age 4. In 1906, Clara met a man named Robert Pierce, who was a newly arrived doctor in Hatchfield Crossing with a practice above the general store and a steady disposition and genuine respect for the force of nature that was Clara McCrae. He arrived at the ranch for the first time in October of that year, brought by Clara with the quiet inevitability of something she had already decided, and Lionel shook his hand and Mae looked him over in the way she had been looking people over for 30 years, the comprehensive evaluation that had never lost its precision. She told Lionel that night that she liked him. "You're sure?" Lionel said because he knew she was, but he asked because he wanted to hear her say it. "He looked at Clara the way you look at me," Mae said. "That was sufficient." Lionel was quiet for a moment. "What way is that?" "Like she's the most interesting thing in the room," Mae said, always without needing to say it. Lionel considered this. "That's a good observation," he said. "Most of my observations are," she said. Robert Pierce married Clara McCrae in the spring of 1907, in the same open air beside the ranch house where Mae and Lionel had married 28 years before, with the mountains behind them and the valley spread out below, and the same creek running along the east border with the same sound of years in it. Mae stood beside Lionel through the ceremony with her hand in his, and watched her daughter marry a man who looked at her like the most interesting thing in the room, and she felt the completeness of the occasion settle over her the way only certain moments could, the ones that closed a circle. Lionel caught her eye during the ceremony, and she knew he was thinking what she was thinking, that this was the same ground, the same sky, the same fundamental thing, and that it was continuing forward. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The years that followed were the years that filled in, the ones that accumulated with the texture of a full life. Jack and Helen had 2 more children, a daughter named Ruth in 1907 and another son, George, in 1910. Clara and Robert had a son they named John, for Mae's father, in 1908, and a daughter, Lily, in 1911. Mae was a grandmother to 5 living, breathing, specific children, each of them their own complete person, each of them connected by a line of love and stubbornness and hard work. And one October afternoon in 1878, when a woman pointed a rifle at a stranger and the stranger didn't flinch. She told them stories, the grandchildren, when they came to the ranch in the summers. She told them about their grandfather's first arrival and the rifle, which they found enormously entertaining, and Lionel would sit in his chair by the window with an expression of patient suffering while she described it, occasionally interjecting with clarifications that she disputed and that the grandchildren adjudicated enthusiastically. "She had it pointed right at my chest," Lionel would say. "I was establishing the parameters," Mae would say. "Parameters," Lionel would say. "That's what we're calling it. I hired you, didn't I?" After some significant preliminary negotiation, he would say, and the grandchildren would look back and forth between them like they were watching a very entertaining play, which in a sense they were. William, Jack's eldest, was the one most drawn to the ranch, spending his summers learning the work with the same quiet seriousness his father had shown. He was 14 in 1919, old enough to do real work and to understand what he was doing, and Lionel spent those summers with him the way he had spent time with Jack, teaching in the way of people who teach by doing, who show rather than tell and trust the learner to watch and learn. Mae watched Lionel with the grandchildren and felt something she did not have a precise word for, a sense of abundance, of the rightness of things not perfect, because nothing was perfect and the years had not been without loss and difficulty and grief, but right, in the way that a well-built fence is right, solid and purposeful and made to last. She was 65 in 1919. Lionel was 68. They had slowed in the way of people who had been moving fast for a very long time, adjusted their pace to match their bodies without stopping, because stopping was not in their nature. The heavy ranch work was done by younger hands now, by Deke Webb's son and the men he brought with him, and by William in the summers, and Jack when he came to visit. But Mae and Lionel were still there at 5 in the morning and still in the barn when something needed doing and still making decisions that kept the operation sound. The coffee was still on the kitchen step in the mornings, only now it was Mae who made it, because the porch step ritual had long since reversed itself in the way of many things in a long marriage, not because it was planned, but because the patterns of closeness evolved in ways that couldn't be predicted. She made the coffee and set it on the step for them both, and he would come out and they would stand in the early light with their cups and look at the valley in whatever season it was wearing, and she thought there was not a single morning of it she would trade. On a morning in late September of 1919, she was standing on the porch with her coffee watching the valley go gold in the early light the way it did every September, the aspens turning, the grass going amber, the mountains above it all still holding summer at their tops and releasing it in stages. And Lionel came out with his cup and stood beside her in the way he had been standing beside her for 40 years. "It's a fine morning," he said. "It's the finest valley in the world," she said. "Don't argue with me." "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm agreeing." She looked over at him. The morning light was kind to both of them, illuminating the gray of his hair and the lines of his face with the particular honesty of early light, which showed things clearly without judgment. He was looking at the valley with the expression he had always had when he looked at it, from the first time she had watched him on that ridge in February of 1879 when the sky turned impossibly blue, a look of recognition and belonging. "Lionel," she said. He looked at her. "I'm glad I didn't shoot you," she said. He laughed the warm, surprised laugh that 40 years had not reduced by a single degree, and she felt it in her chest the way she always had, warm and right and home. "I'm glad, too," he said. "It would have been a terrible waste." "Of the rifle cartridge," she said. "Of everything," he said and looked at her steadily. "Of everything, Mae." She looked at him for a long moment with the valley and the mountains behind him and the blue sky coming on above everything. And she thought about the October morning he had arrived, and the February morning on the ridge and the June morning they were married and every morning since. Thousands of mornings. And she thought that if she had to do it again, she would do every piece of it, including the hard pieces, including the loss and the difficult years and the worry and the work. because the hard pieces were part of it too. Part of what made it real. "Come in," she said. "Breakfast is ready." He followed her inside, the way he had been following her inside for 40 years, into the warm kitchen in the house her father had built, the house she had kept and they had kept together and their children had grown up in, and their grandchildren visited in the summers, the house that had been a home because two particular people had made it one. She put the skillet on the stove. He sat at the table with his coffee. The morning light came through the window and lay across the floor in long bars of gold, and outside the valley was turning the deep amber of a Colorado autumn, and the mountains were white at the top and green at the middle and brown at the base, and the creek ran along the east border with its old familiar sound, carrying everything that had ever moved through it toward wherever everything went. Mae Gentry had stood on the porch of this house at 24 years old with a Winchester rifle and a heart armored by loss, and she had told a stranger he had 3 seconds to explain himself, and he had explained himself. And then he had stayed, through one winter and the next, and every one that followed, and he was still there in February and in spring and in summer, and in the autumn years of the life they had made together. Still there in the kitchen with his coffee and his steady eyes and his certain presence. Still there when the grandchildren ran through the yard and called his name and climbed onto his lap and asked him to tell the story about grandmother and the rifle. He always told it the same way. He always said she was the most formidable person he had ever seen, and that he knew from the first moment that he was not going to leave. And me, listening from wherever she was in the room, always said that was revisionist history, and he always said it was the absolute truth. And they would disagree with the easy warmth of two people for whom disagreement had long since become another form of conversation, another form of closeness, another thread in the long, complicated, beautiful weaving of a life that had been a daring and a staying and a choosing and a love, every day of it, morning after morning in the valley that was theirs, that they had kept and built and left forward into the hands of the people who came after. Me set the eggs in the pan and heard the sizzle of them and the sound of Lionel's cup on the table and the sound of the wind coming down from the mountains the way it always had, and she thought there was nowhere else on earth she had ever wanted to be and no one else she had ever wanted to stand beside, and she thought that was the truest and most important thing she had ever known, and she thought it was enough. More than enough. It was everything, and she was grateful for every word of it. "Are you going to stand there philosophizing all morning?" Lionel said behind her. "Or are you going to make the eggs?" "I'm making the eggs," she said. "You've been standing there for a full minute," he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She turned and looked at him, sitting at the table in the morning light, gray-haired and steady-eyed and utterly, completely, unchangeably himself. "About how glad I am that you stayed," she said. He looked at her with the look she knew the best, the warm, unguarded, certain look that had been the same from February 1879 to this September morning in 1919. Unchanged by 40 years of Colorado winters and summer droughts and difficult decisions and grief and joy, and the ordinary accumulated treasure of days lived alongside a person you loved. "I was always going to stay," he said. "I know," she said. "Eventually, I knew." She turned back to the eggs and he drank his coffee, and the morning moved forward into the day, and the day moved forward into the life. And the life was whole and full and finished in the best possible sense of that word, complete in the way that things were complete when they had become exactly what they were always meant to be.